This podcast is made possible by you, the supporters of WPLN and WNXP, Nashville Public Radio.
This is the Nash Villager Podcast. It's March 7th, 2025, the anniversary of a pivotal and tragic milestone in the civil rights movement, Bloody Sunday. On this day in 1965, more than 600 protesters started a march that was supposed to take them from Selma, Alabama, to the state capitol in Montgomery. Several veterans of Nashville's lunch counter sit-ins and the Freedom Rides were there, including John Lewis, who was right at the front of the group. As they crossed Selma's Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were met by state troopers wearing gas masks, sheriff's deputies on horseback, and a rambunctious crowd itching for a fight. Television cameras recorded the violence as peaceful protesters were tear-gassed, physically assaulted, and arrested. The shocking images ricocheted across the nation and are credited with spurring support for passage of the Civil Rights Act, which was signed into law later that year. I'm Nina Cardona, and this is your daily digest of what's happening around Middle Tennessee with historical context from Nashville Public Radio, WPLN News. The struggle for civil rights in this country began long before the Montgomery bus boycott. It is extended long beyond the events of Selma, and it's certainly not over yet. Nashville recently lost a man who led the charge here during one of the chapters that followed that particular era of concentrated effort we're usually referring to when we talk about the movement. Dr. Charles Kimbrough grew up in rural Tennessee. His home was in Prospect, near Pulaski. And if you've never heard of Prospect, well, it's tiny. It's so small that the Wikipedia entry only tells you the zip code and the fact that it is unincorporated. Other sources claim that the current population is just 98 people. And Kimbrough was there in the early 20th century. Now, I don't know exactly what life would have been like for a black boy growing up during the Jim Crow era in the same county where the KKK was founded, but I think we have a general idea of what kind of hardships he probably faced. Kimbrough served in the Korean War, and when he came back, he used his GI benefits to become a licensed veterinarian, one of the first black veterinarians in Tennessee. He was a minister, too, but he's best known for his very active role in the NAACP. Kimbrough established chapters in two small Tennessee towns, Pulaski and Waverly, and in two Illinois communities, too. And for much of the 1970s, he was president of the Nashville branch. That was a time when the first wave of basic integration steps was kind of finished. The painfully simple blanket bans on black and white people sharing space in places like schools and restaurants and movie theaters were gone. And the white establishment probably thought, okay, all done, right? But of course, there was still far more to sort out. And the 70s were marked by a second wave of drilling down into the details. So, for example, one issue that Nashvillians fought about at that time was busing children across town to create schools that weren't just theoretically integrated, but that actually had student bodies with racial mixes that were somewhat proportional to the city as a whole. As debates like that one raged, the NAACP was an important voice for making sure black interests and needs were considered, and Charles Kimbrough was leading that charge in Nashville. One victory that Kimbrough's NAACP won was the construction of the Jubilee Bridge between I-40 cutting through the middle of Jefferson Street and the railroad ravine that cut North Nashville off from Charlotte Avenue. People living in one of Nashville's most important black neighborhoods had few ways to get in and out. The Jubilee Bridge created that point of access, extending the street that runs between Fisk and Meharry's campuses over the railroad tracks so that what is now called D.B. Todd Boulevard can run from Charlotte, across Jefferson, and all the way to Clarksville Highway. And then there was the horrible case of Ronald Joyce, a TSU sophomore killed by police after someone accused him of breaking into a vacant house. Metro officials claimed Joyce had it coming. MNPD closed its internal investigation of Joyce's killing just 3 days after the incident. This was back in 1973, the same year Kimbrough became chapter president. The community responded with protests calling for reforms. They wanted black officers in black neighborhoods, an oversight board, and for the chief of police to step down. He actually did leave the job. But still, there was no autopsy. Even though the DA did take the case to a grand jury, there wasn't enough hard evidence to get an indictment against the officers. But Kimbrough pushed and pushed until Joyce's body was exhumed and autopsied. And that finally showed that the official account of what happened wasn't true. Joyce hadn't been fighting the officers. He was running away. The shotgun blast that killed him hit him in the back. In 2016, Dr. Kimbrough was given an award for a lifetime of dedication to furthering human rights. The ceremony was held about a month after President Trump was elected to his first term. The Tennessee Tribune reported that Kimbrough said the election cycle had reawakened overt racism in American society, and he had a message for Black people of our era. He said, quote, "We must use what we've fought so long to get. Don't be apathetic and not use the right to register and vote. Be engaged." Dr. Kimbrough died March 1st. He was 98 years old, and he'll be laid to rest next week. In just a few minutes, how federal layoffs are impacting a national park very close to Nashville. That's coming up after the newscast.
Tennessee's legislature has passed a record-breaking number of anti-LGBTQ laws. I'm Mariana Baca-Yao, and as WPLN's Power and Equity reporter, I focus not only on how marginalized communities contend with those new laws, but how they come together in spite of them.
I think what gives me hope is that someone like you is covering this. Because if the overwhelming narrative is one of defeat, how can we have hope?
Listen here on 90.3 WPLN News.
Here's the latest from WPLN News. The Metro Nashville Police Department has added a sexual misconduct policy to its manual and explicitly made sexual harassment and misconduct a zero-tolerance offense. WPLN's Paige Flagler reports the changes come after nearly 5 years of advocacy.
Since 2020, nearly 100 current and former officers have come forward with complaints. One officer said a colleague forcibly kissed her. Another said she was strangled and raped by a fellow officer. And another called the department a boys' club and said anyone who complains could expect their reputation and career to be destroyed. Those stories are what pushed the organization Silent No Longer to advocate for reform. A document obtained by WPLN shows all department personnel were alerted to the changes, and the policies go into effect immediately. Paige Flagler, WPLN News.
3 deaf, incarcerated people and Disability Rights Tennessee have reached a settlement with the Tennessee Department of Corrections over accommodations. The settlement will ensure that all deaf people in TDOC custody will have access to video phones, sign language interpreters, and other tools that allow them to participate in programming and services behind bars. It marks the conclusion of a 2020 lawsuit that alleged TDOC was violating the Americans with Disabilities Act. Under the terms of the settlement, TDOC said it would provide interpreters for crucial interactions like intake and orientation, medical appointments, educational programming, and disciplinary proceedings. The department will also provide video phones at every facility housing deaf prisoners, as well as intake facilities, so deaf people can communicate via sign language. Tennessee businesses and farmers are bracing for the impact of President Donald Trump's tariffs. Republican State Representative William Lambert says the state does not plan to offer temporary payment to farmers who may see a dip in revenue because of the trade war.
There is concern about it right now, but we've not actually seen any of those concerns bear out. So we're going to continue to watch this over the next few months and years. But again, to be very crystal clear, Tennessee supported President Trump strongly in the election, and we trust him to truly make America great again.
Republican leaders in the State House are also encouraging Tennesseans to shop locally to support the state's farmers. Tennessee students may soon be forced to part with their cell phones during school hours. Both the State House and Senate passed a bill this week that bans classroom cell phone use. WPLN education reporter Camelia Burris reports that the bill is now heading to Governor Bill Lee's desk.
The bill requires Tennessee schools to ban students from using cell phones and other wireless devices during instructional hours. School districts can decide how the ban is implemented. One school may prohibit cell phones during the entire school day. Another might only restrict cell phone use during classroom instruction hours. State Representative William Lambert supports this local control.
So it's not us setting one policy for every school district in the state. It's literally saying, hey, look, just look at this and see what makes sense in each school. And that's going to vary, I guarantee you, from elementary schools to middle schools to high schools.
Some expressed concern about students' ability to reach their parents in case of an emergency, like a school shooting. The bill requires school boards to put in place a policy that they will communicate with parents during emergency situations. Students with disabilities, other medical needs, or those who rely on wireless devices for educational purposes will be exempt from the ban. State Representative Cameron Sexton noted cell phones' impact on increased suicide, bullying, and social disorders.
So anything you can do to keep that out of the classroom, I think, is beneficial.
If Governor Lee signs the bill into law, it will take effect on July 1st and apply to the 2025 to 2026 school year. Camelia Burris, WPLN News.
Additional soldiers from Fort Campbell left yesterday to work at the U.S. southern border. The 300 soldiers are part of the 101st Airborne Division and will be divided among locations in Arizona and Texas. They joined a deployment that left in January to work with the Department of Homeland Security and Customs and Border Protection. Science supporters across the country are turning out to protest today, and that will include a demonstration at the Capitol building in Nashville. The demonstrations are in reaction to a wave of policies and policy proposals from the Trump administration, like putting a lockdown on public health information, slashing funding for medical research, and punishing universities for even mentioning diversity in a public way. Theodore Morley is a data scientist in a lab in Nashville, and he's one of the academics volunteering for Nashville's protest.
From my perspective, a lot of what's been happening is just a outright aggressive attack on science from basically every angle. Lots of people I know have been dealing with censorship from the current administration, words that people aren't allowed to use. Grants haven't been being reviewed, so that funding that goes out to science has been slowed, if not completely stopped.
The group has several policy demands, which include protections for public science funding and from political censorship. The protest will take place on the Capitol's East Steps from 1 to 4 p.m. You'll find more news anytime at WPLN.org. The Trump administration has begun firing staff at national parks across the country. WKU reporter Derek Parham reports Mammoth Cave National Park in southern Kentucky is just one of the sites already feeling the effects of the sweeping measures.
This is the first call for the 10:30 resort tour.
It's raining and late into the winter season at Mammoth Cave National Park. Tourism season is still weeks away, but families are lining up inside the visitor center for regular cave tours.
We gotta walk over there, right?
Park officials will have to do more with less this year, as the proverbial trimming of the fat is underway under President Donald Trump and senior advisor Elon Musk's sweeping order to rescind offers for seasonal employment at national parks.
I was not laid off. I was fired. We were all fired with no concept of ever being able to come back to this job.
That's cave guide Emily Wheat. She says she's one of 20 employees in the park's Interpretation and Visitor Resources Division who lost their jobs. That's not including other park divisions like maintenance, administration, or resource management. She was one of 1,700 employees across the country that received an email on Valentine's Day, ending her probationary employment.
The department determined that you have failed to demonstrate fitness or qualifications for continued employment because your subject matter knowledge, skills, and abilities do not meet the department's current needs.
Wheat is the daughter of a longtime cave guide at the national park and dreamed of following in her dad's footsteps. She's worked at Mammoth Cave in various roles for around 4 years and received a permanent job offer last August. Regular employee assessments say Wheat was the ideal employee, leading cave tours and creating lasting park programs.
I had actually been able to create a Bark Ranger program for our park and held the first Bark Ranger Day. And I know some of my friends had done some awesome stuff too, and 3 of us were let go.
She was just 10 days from the end of her probationary period when she got that email.
These are the people who take care of you essentially on your trips to parks, and they also make sure the toilets are clean and that the visitor centers are open and that hand you your map.
That's Kristen Bringle, the VP of Government Affairs for the National Parks Conservation Association. She's been a liaison between the parks and the federal government for over 20 years and says the sweeping measures put in place by the Trump administration aren't considering the vital roles played by these seasonal employees.
It isn't being done in a thoughtful manner. It's just being done in a blanket way, just getting rid of people, but not really thinking through who you're getting rid of.
The probationary employees who lost their jobs were on top of another 2,000 seasonal employees who had offers rescinded in early February.
This could have dramatic effects on people's visits to the national parks, and in some cases, this could mean that parks don't even have the leadership that they need in order to manage them.
For the longest cave system in the world, that could mean limited tours and park hours and an economic downturn for neighboring communities. According to the National Park Service, Mammoth Cave brought in just under $90 million to communities within 60 miles of the park in 2023. Bringle says that impact is multiplied nationwide.
$55 billion is what the Park Service generated to the United States economy.
Training at Mammoth Cave for things like first aid and park history was set to begin February 24th, but there weren't any employees to train because of the cuts. 3 days later, the National Park Service released a statement saying it now intends to hire seasonal employees. The National Park Service did not respond to a request to interview and did not provide information on how many seasonal offers would be resent. While the Trump administration continues to strip away park resources, dedicated people like Wheat say they'll wait as long as it takes to return to their dream careers.
I'll be back. No question, I'll be back. Anything I can do to be able to be there, I'm going to do it because I love my job.
I'm Derek Parham in Bowling Green.
Recent visitor statistics show Mammoth Cave hosted some 700,000 people in 2024. That's up substantially over recent years. Compared to 2020, cave visits have more than doubled. Great Smoky National Park remains the most visited in the nation, with some 12 million visitors, though it did see a dip in 2024. That park is also facing at least a dozen staff cuts and worries that more will follow in the spring. Officials worry that understaffing could lead to more trash in the park and dirtier restrooms, among other challenges. We do this roundup of Nashville news every weekday. Please consider subscribing on your favorite podcasting app. And thanks so much to all of you who have left 5 stars, a thumbs up, or a review in your app of choice. And thank you very much to everyone who took a stand for public broadcasting on yesterday's Protect Public Media Day. And of course, everything at WPLN News is listener supported, and you can make a donation at WPLN.org. And that's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. Let's make this day a good one, and we'll catch back up next week.